Hello and welcome to our lecture hosted by Worldwide Christian Travel and GGC Jerusalem. Today, Joel Weinberg will be discussing the temple in Jerusalem, history, theology, and the place it played in Jesus' mission. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, which I will take from the chat. With a master's from Hebrew University, Jerusalem, Joel is dedicated to teaching the New Testament to Jews and Judaism to Christians. He is well trained in biblical interpretations, theology, and Middle Eastern affairs. Joel was a guest lecturer on the topic of Judaism at Lund University, Sweden, Harvard University in the USA, and the University of Oxford here in the UK, plus many other renowned universities around the world. Joel is also a fully qualified guide and has guided a number of our groups, so please let us know when organising your next tour if you would like to utilise Joel's vast knowledge. Before I hand you over to Joel, just another quick reminder, please, to keep your microphones on mute for the duration of the lecture. Thank you. Over to you, Joel.
Okay, well, good afternoon to everybody. And what I'm going to try to do today is take us, it'll be slightly different than the previous lecture because we're going to be following the history of Jerusalem from the beginning, the evolution of what Jerusalem, and especially in the early stages, the Temple Mount, which plays a major part because we'll be discussing Jesus in the temple quite a bit. And then read that in and see some joint traditions, evolution of traditions, and how that comes to play in the life of Jesus. So let's start at the very beginning. Here's some traditions and stories connected to Jerusalem. This comes from Midrash Tanhuma, the 2nd century Jewish, almost stories or traditions that existed, and it says this: as the navel is set in the center of the human body, so is the land of Israel the navel of the world. In other words, the land of Israel and situated in the center of the world, and Jerusalem is the center of the land of Israel, and the sanctuary, the center of Jerusalem, and the holy place in the center of the sanctuary, and the ark in the center of the holy place. And the foundation stone, we'll discuss a bit about the foundation stone, which is the stone which is in the center of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. On that, most researchers will say that's where the Ark of the Covenant in the first temple was located, and that's where the Holy of Holies was. So that is considered literally the center of the earth. And it's called the navel because the tradition that they talk about is that's where the earth was created from, because from it the world was founded. So the original belief was that the whole element of creation of the world started from Jerusalem. Here we can see the foundation stone. Many, many things took place here. You can see parts of it is carved out. Now it is in the center of the Dome of the Rock, the golden building, which is mistakenly said, many people mistake it and think it's a mosque. It is not, but it's now a Muslim holy site where you have the actual stone that the tradition is, and most likely factually, that's where the Holy of Holies was. You can see some of the side carving in it. That was most likely carved to place the actual Ark of the Covenant on. Unfortunately, during the Crusader time, they would chisel away pieces of that stone and sell them as relics worth their weight in gold. You see a hole in the center of it that also most likely dates from the time of the Crusaders, where they made that to enable smoke from candles that were lit there to come out. There's actually a cave underneath there, which we will talk about a little bit later. So this is the stone that the tradition is the Jewish tradition is the center of the earth, and from this all was created. We'll keep that in mind because we'll be talking about that soon. Now, dust of the earth. This is quoted by Rashi, a medieval Jewish commentator who based his claims on 1st and 2nd century Jewish sources. And he says this: he gathered his dust. Remember, Adam was created from dust or from clay. It depends how you read it. Remember the clay, remember the dust. He gathered his dust, in other words, God gathered his dust from the entire earth, from its 4 corners, in order that whenever he might die, it should receive him for burial. We're talking about the creation of man. Another explanation, he took his dust from the spot on which the holy temple with the altar of atonement was in later times to be built, of which it is said, an altar of earth, which is the early commandment of building an altar already in the desert, thou shalt make for me. Saying, would that this sacred earth may be of expiation for me so that he may be able to endure. In other words, the tradition that Adam is said to have been created by dirt or clay, keep that in mind. We'll be returning to that towards the end of the lecture. The dirt or the clay or the dust came from the location that the temple was later to be built on. This is a slightly different description of the creation story, but each person can have his own perception or version. Let's go forward. Adam dies. Where is he brought back? We read, then God spake to the archangel or angels, Michael, there's a different source, it says Gabriel, Uriel, and Raphael, go away to paradise in the third heaven and strew linen cloths and cover the body of Adam. Adam had died, and bring oil of fragrance and pour it over him. Remember, similar to the way Jesus was buried. In the Jewish tradition, you cover somebody with oil, you in a way anoint them. And they acted thus, did the three great angels, and they prepared him for burial. And God said, let the body of Abel also be brought. At that time, the angels took it and placed it on the rock. That's the rock we just saw. Till Adam, his father, was buried in the cave underneath where we saw the hole was coming out from. And both were buried according to the commandment of God in the spot where God found the dust, and he caused the place to be dug for two. And God called and said, Adam, Adam. And the body answered from the earth and said, here am I, Lord. Remember, that's very similar to Abraham's response when he said, Abraham, Abraham. He said, here I am, Lord. And God saith to him, I told thee that thou art, that thou art, and to the earth shall thou return. Again, I promise to thee the resurrection. Please remember this. I will raise thee up in the resurrection with every man who is of thy seed. This is a book called the Apocalypse of Moses, usually dated 1st or maybe even 2nd century BC. So now suddenly we have a man that many of you will recognize. Now, what is Mark Twain doing here? Well, Mark Twain visited Israel or visited the Holy Land in the middle of the 19th century, following his mother's trip to the Holy Land. She was a devout Christian and wrote back saying how wonderful everything was. Mark Twain, in his own way, came back and wrote a very cynical, very cynical article. And this is what he said. The Greek chapel, that's what we're talking about in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, is the most roomy, the richest, and the showiest chapel in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Anybody who's been there has seen it. We'll see a picture of it in 1 second. Its altar, like that of all the Greek churches, is a lofty screen that extends clear across the chapel and is gorgeous with gilding and pictures. The numerous lamps that hang before it are of gold and silver and cost great sums. Though he's being cynical here because during a lot of his trip, he talked about the severe poverty that actually existed in the Holy Land in those days. But the feature of the place is a short column that rises from the middle of the marble pavement of the chapel and marks the exact center of the earth. Here we have the original tradition that talks about where the Ark of the Covenant was. The foundation stone has moved to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The most reliable tradition tells us that this was known to be the earth's center ages ago, and that when Christ was upon earth, he set all doubts upon the subject at rest forever by stating with his own lips that the tradition was correct. Remember, he said that that particular column stood upon the center of the world. If the center of the world changes, the column changes its position accordingly. Here we can see the church. Right over here behind this golden box is a small column. That is considered the center of the earth. That's where it's marked. If even greater proofs than those I have mentioned are wanted to satisfy the headstrong and the foolish that this is the genuine center of the earth, they are here. The greatest of them lies, in fact, that from under this column was taken the dust from which Adam was made. Once again, we saw the Jewish tradition was adopted and moved to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Again, Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the location of the traditional location of the Golgotha, of Calvary, same thing, the place where Jesus was crucified, then purified, then buried. This can surely be regarded in the light of a settler. It is not likely that the original first man would have been made from an inferior quality of earth when it was entirely convenient to get first quality from the world center. You can hear the cynicism to an extreme. It is a singular circumstance that right under the roof of this same great church and not far away from the illustrious column, Adam himself, the father of human race, lies buried. There is no question that he's actually buried in the grave, which is pointed out as there can be none because it has never yet been proven that the grave is not the grave in which he is buried. Now, we have the quotation of Mark Twain, but the more interesting thing, with severe cynicism, of course, but he's quoting the traditions that existed vis-a-vis that spot, and that's the more important element, because we can see it. The name of the book was Innocents Abroad. It's a wonderful read. I highly recommend it to get a very good feeling of the Middle East in those days. But he's talking cynically, but those traditions moved from the Temple Mount over to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Additional traditions that exist, that it's the place of Eden, that Noah came here to make a sacrifice after he came off of his ark. There are multiple Muslim traditions. It is that the foundation stone is the rocks of paradise, that the rock of Jerusalem turned into a white coral, that actually is an interpretation of a hadith of a Muslim oral tradition. The master of all rocks in the world is Jerusalem. The whole earth's water comes from under the rock, from that whole area, that area we saw. That water is continuously coming out of the rock and flows and fills the world. And last but not least, it is on a river from paradise. The rock is the middle of the world, just like we talked about in Judaism and in Christianity. Now, let's see other things that happened connected to that site that will come back, and we will come across them in the near future when we reach the New Testament. Now, it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am, just like we remember Adam saying. Then he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. There's a wonderful Jewish parable that talks about when God says, Abraham didn't really want to take Isaac. So God said, take your son. Abraham's response was, but I have two sons. And he says, your only son. He says, this is the only son to his mother, and this is the only son to his mother. He said, whom you love? He says, I love both of them. And then he said, take Isaac. And that's why the translation distorts that story, because in the Hebrew, it says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. That's the Hebrew text of it. The translation destroyed that parable. And go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I shall tell you. Now, where is this land of Moriah? If we go to 2 Chronicles, we read this. Now Solomon, this is Solomon building the first temple, around 950 BC. Now Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. So the tradition is the location of that stone is the same location that Solomon wound up building his temple on, where the Lord had appeared to his father David in the place David prepared on the threshing cold, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes. So the tradition is the continuation that Isaac was bound in the same spot that Adam was created from, in the same spot where the world was created from. Here we can see a modern-day threshing field in the West Bank, the rock in the center, and the threshing that takes place and the beating. And here you can once again see the stone. You can see the similarity between the stone of the threshing field and the stone, and we'll talk about threshing field in David. And once again, here we are in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right near Golgotha. Here we have a mosaic on the floor, really on the wall, of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, because in Christian tradition, frequently the story of Abraham and Isaac being brought to an altar, is a prefiguration of Jesus being bound on the cross. So it's a prefiguration, except in the case of Jesus, Jesus was actually killed, while in Isaac's case, he was not challenged by death as Jesus was. So let's go over to David. And David purchases Aravna's threshing floor. And it goes like this. And when the angel stretched out his hand over Jerusalem to destroy it, the Lord relented from the destruction and said to the angel who was destroying the people, because the Jewish people once again were being punished by God, "It is enough, now restrain your hand." Again, interestingly enough, the location, the angel stopping the killing once again, and the angel of the Lord was by the threshing floor of, here it's called Aruna, and the Hebrew name is Aravna, the Jebusite. We don't know who the Jebusites were. Most likely, based on archaeological finds that were found, the Jebusites were very similar to the Canaanites. The important thing is they controlled Jerusalem. And Gad, one of the prophets, came that day to David and said to him, "Go up, erect an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Aravna the Jebusite." So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen for 50 shekels of silver, very similar to Abraham purchasing the Machpelah cave in Hebron. And David built there an altar to the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. So the Lord heeded the prayers for the land, and the plague was withdrawn from Israel. So David purchased the place, built an altar on it. But here we can get an idea. I like this specific picture because you actually see the walls of Jerusalem behind it, which again, the original Jebusite walls of the city. David captures Jerusalem, and this is very important because now we're already starting to link to New Testament stories. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who spoke to David, saying, "You shall not come in here, but the blind and the lame will repel you." The original text really says, the king says, "I'll put the blind and the lame to guard my city," thinking David cannot come in here. That even if I put the blind and the lame, you will not succeed capturing the said city. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. Because the Hebrew term is the stronghold or the fortress of Zion. Zion was originally the name of Jerusalem, was the name of the Temple Mountain. Mount Zion, where the Last Supper took place, is a later name. And that's where also traditionally today David's tomb is, even though for sure that's not David's tomb, because the Bible tells us that David was buried in his city, the city of David. Now, David said on that day, "Whoever climbs up by the water shaft," again, water shaft they're taking for granted, influenced by modern Hebrew. It says a word sinor, that we don't know what that means. It might be a pipe. Captain Charles Warren, the great British soldier and archaeologist, found a tube that goes through when you go through the city of David. Now we know that could not have been the case, because it's known as Warren Shaft, but that's a different story. And defeats the Jebusites, the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul, which is a very strange statement, but we'll understand it in 1 minute. He shall be chief and captain. Therefore they say, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house Probably the house of God, not clear. Now, why did David hate the blind and the lame? What did they do to him? Because in David's time, the tradition was that if you are blind or if you are lame, it is a punishment from God. So if God punishes you, you did something that God did not want. Now, I'm sure some of you, it's already crossing your brains. The two miracles Jesus performed in Jerusalem were the curing of the lame and the bringing sight to the blind. We'll deal with that in 1 second. Now, here we can see the city of David in the time of David and David's palace on the top. Here we have the spring of the Shiloh or the Gihon, where the walls built again by the Canaanites before David. David built his palace on the top of the hill. That's archaeological digs in the last 10 years have proven beyond doubt. And of course, the archaeologists read the Bible that most people had overlooked before. And when it talks about David going down from his palace to the city, of course, his palace was on the top. There's a stepped stone wall here from probably the 16th century BC, and above it was where the temple was built. But David was not allowed to build the city because he had blood on his hands. We'll talk about that soon. So let's talk about the two miracles performed by Jesus in Jerusalem. This is more or less what the pools of Bethesda would have looked like. First one dates from the first temple period, in other words, probably around 800 BC. Second one, built probably 100, 200 BC, used most likely predominantly to wash the sheep for the sacrifices in the temple. And that's why people thought they would have special powers, because those animals were later on burnt to God. And there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Again, Bible commands us 3 times a year. People do not actually keep that, but you're supposed to go up to Jerusalem for pilgrimage on Passover, on the Jewish feast of Pentecost, and on the feast of Sukkot, the feast of the booths. Now there is at Jerusalem by the sheep market a pool, which is called the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. And a certain man was there which had an infirmity 38 years. Again, 38 years is interesting. We're not going to talk about now, but it's a number that has a lot of meaning to it. When Jesus saw him lie and knew he had been now a long time in the case, he saith unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man. When the water is troubled, because the tradition was when the water would move, the first person to touch it, I'm sure you're all aware of it, would be cured, to put me in the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus saith him, Rise, take up thy bed and walk. And immediately the man was made whole and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. Later on, the whole argument with the Pharisees, can you cure somebody on the Sabbath or not? Different lecture. Today, there is also the Church of St. Anne there, because there are 2 traditions where Mary was born. Was she born in Jerusalem, or was she born in Cephreus, that we'll talk a little bit about later, which is a town very close to Nazareth. There's a Church of St. Anne in Cephreus. There are 2 churches of St. Anne in Jerusalem. This is a spectacular Crusader church, perfectly preserved, 1,000 years old, with the most, anybody that's been there is aware of the acoustics, maybe the most spectacular acoustics you'll come across anywhere. Now we have the healing of the blind man, the pool of Siloam. This is similar, would have been, the truth matters, there's an attempt to get an idea of what the pool looked like. The pool would have been slightly larger than this, but still a spectacular pool where the water flows from the Gihon through Hezekiah's tunnel that was built during the siege on Jerusalem, or just before, in 701. And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from birth. And it's very important, they make the point to say it was blind from birth, because when he had thus spoken, we'll come back to, we skipped a few verses, we'll understand why in a minute. He spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle. Remember, the clay that brought life to Adam, the concept of clay having a regenerating, or almost, you can almost say that Jesus is taking God Father's place because he's using the same clay from very similar location where Adam was created from. And he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay and said unto him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. Shiloach means to send away because it flows. He went his way, therefore, and washed and came seeing. Here we can see one of the few cases, you can see a picture when the pool actually filled up. That here is the archaeological pool that's been dug up. The rains were so spectacular that they filled up with water. Here we have Jesus's healings, two nice pictures. And now, back to what we cut out. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Because his disciples, it was clear and understood that being blind was a punishment from God. Let's go back to David. Same location almost. David's approach.
Sorry, are you still there? No.
So once again, the element is that David
Sorry,
is
Julian.
a prefiguration of Jesus, but inferior to him. Jesus descended of David, but while David judges people by believing that they were there by sin, Jesus answered, neither hath this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. So once again, the play on the element of clay, doing God's work as God created Adam. So Jesus, using the same thing, cured the man. Solomon's temple, as he built it, and it came to pass when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest. Now we're talking about David. Rest round about from all of his enemies. That the king saith unto Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in the house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth within curtains. Then he called for Solomon his son and charged him to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. And David said to Solomon, my son, as for me, it was in my mind to build an house unto the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, thou hast shed blood abundantly, and hast made great wars. Thou shalt not build a house unto my name, because you hast shed much blood upon the earth in my sight. In other words, the building of the temple in Jerusalem was forbade because he shed blood. We'll come to Jesus and deal with that, the exact opposite later. So somebody who's spilled a lot of blood cannot build the temple. Here is Solomon's temple. We can get a nice idea. The two pillars, Boaz and Yachin, the altar for sacrifices, the water basin. Now, the Solomon's temple had many names. It was called the temple, the place which the Lord your God has chosen thee to dwell in, sanctuary, the Lord's house. And the Lord's house is very interesting because we see here the Lord's house, and here we see Solomon's house. Because in those days, in that part of the world, the tradition was, it was a king's temple. In other words, it was a temple to God, the king, but built by the person who had his house right next to it. The Lord said he would dwell in the dark cloud. And this is Solomon saying, I surely built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever. So once again, keep that in mind. That we'll come back and talk about that soon. God actually dwelling in the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is. Again, here we can get an idea of the temple. this is the molten sea or the basin where the water was held. Here we have the holy, where we have the golden altar, where we have the menorah. In Solomon's temple, there were 10 menorahs. We have the showbread. And in here we have the Holy of Holies and the Ark of Covenant, which we'll talk about in just a couple of minutes, or even right now. The Ark of Covenant, very frequently wrongly depicted. Here we have the Ark and the Kruvim, the cherubs that are facing each other. It says, Ufnehem ish el achiv, and their faces to each other, and they are covering, sochechim b'chanfeihem, they're protecting with their wings over the Ark. First time we came across the cherubim or the kruvim is in the Garden of Eden. Remember, one of the traditions is that this is the location of Garden of Eden. They were the ones who protected the Garden of Eden. Now they're protecting the same location, coming back a tradition, coming back with the Ark on the same location. So he drove out the man and he placed the cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden and the flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. Once again, remember the element of Isaac not being able to die. That's typical, not being able to resurrect, but it's the whole element of the guarding the way and not enabling people the access to the tree of life, eternal life. And Lord of hosts, God of Israel, the one who dwells between the cherubim. Isaiah literally says God's location is in between the cherubim, in between the kruvim or the cherubim. You are God, you alone, and all the kingdoms of earth, you have made heaven and earth. So the location that God dwells, that holiest of spots, is in the Holy of Holies in the temple. God, Isaiah says, the God, quoting God, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. And that's why one of the ways God is defined is Yoshev Keruvim, that he sits on the cherubim. Where is the house that you shall build me? And where is the place of my rest? God will rest in the temple. Now, we'll skip this. This is the last place we have a mentioning of the Ark of the Covenant in 2 Chronicles. King Yoshia is the last time because with the destruction of the first temple, the Ark of the Covenant disappeared. And that's why Spielberg got it slightly wrong. There's in the second temple, the Holy of Holies was empty. There was nothing in there because there was no Ark. Now, in the book of Hebrews, we are told what was in the Ark of Covenant. Then indeed, even the first covenant had ordinances of divine service and earthly sanctuary. For a tabernacle was prepared, the first part in which was the lampstand, the table, and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. And behind the second veil, the part of the tabernacle which is called the holiest of all, which had a golden censer and the Ark of the Covenant overlaid on all sides with gold, in which were the golden pot that had the manna, because the children of Israel are commanded to take the manna in the desert and put it in a pot for permanent presence, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. In reality, the tradition was the tablets of the covenant, of course, the 10 commandments, but also the broken 10 commandments according to the Jewish tradition. And above it were the cherubim, the glory overshadowing the mercy seat, the seat where God sat on. And these things we cannot now speak in detail. Now, in Revelations, we are told, then the temple of God was opened in heaven, that parallel heaven, that reflection that's in heaven, and in the temple in heaven, opened in heaven, and the Ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. So that holiness, that presence disappeared from earth, and there were lightning, noises, thunders, and an earthquake, and great hail. Sounds slightly what happened with Jesus' crucifixion, or when Jesus died on the cross. We'll talk about that very soon. Now, what is the significance? What were some of the interpretations given to the Ark of the Covenant in Christianity? Was signified by the Ark, or this, for in the same manner as the Ark was made of shittim wood, acacia wood, so also was the body of Christ composed of the most pure human substance. So what they're trying to say here is that Jesus is the personification of the Ark. The Ark was entirely overlaid with gold because Christ was filled with wisdom and charity, which gold symbolizes. In the Ark was the golden vase. This represents Jesus' most holy soul, containing the fullness of sanctity and the Godhead, figured by the manna. There was also Aaron's rod to indicate the sacerdotal of Jesus Christ, priest forever. Finally, the stone tablets of the law were likewise contained in the Ark to mean that Jesus Christ's the author of the law. St. Thomas Aquinas said that. Here we have a church just outside of Jerusalem. It's called the Church of Our Lady of the Ark of the Covenant. Here you can see Mary standing on the Ark of the Covenant. This is very close to the location in Givat Yarim, where the Ark waited for hundreds of years from the time it fell into the hands of the Philistines till it was returned to Jerusalem by King David. And the church. Now, what's the connection between Mary and the Ark of the Covenant? Here we have a 3rd century bishop from Alexandria, until today, very Catholic approach. So those of you from the high church might appreciate it. Those of you in the church of the high part of the Church of England. You are greater than them all, O Ark of the Covenant, clothed with purity instead of gold. Of course, they're talking about Mary. You are the ark in which is found the golden vessel, i.e. Jesus, containing the true manna that is the flesh in which divinity resides. So the tradition is that the Ark of the Covenant was a prefiguration of Mary. The temple is destroyed in the year 586. The leadership is taken into exile because we're fast forwarding to the Second Temple. In the year 536, Cyrus's edict permits the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. 516, Zerubbabel, who was a descendant of David, which is very important because this was the last time, till the time of Jesus, that the leadership, people were looking for leaders from the house of David. Zerubbabel disappears in around the year 514. We don't know what happened. 332, Alexander the Great arrives. 167, the Maccabeans revolt, gain control, make themselves rulers, and in some cases rulers or kings and high priests. If you look at Hebrew chapter 7, where Jesus is said to be the high priest from the order of Melchizedek, because Jesus could not be a descendant of Aaron or the priests in the temple because he was said to be a descendant of David. So he was, but if he was a descendant of Melchizedek, who was also considered a priest to God, so he could also be a high priest. Whole different talk. 63, Pompey arrives. In the year 40, King Herod is made the king of the Jews. In the year 19, Herod starts rebuilding the temple, takes, according to the New Testament, and probably quite accurately, around 46 years to completely rebuild it, even though there's some places that we found archaeologically that we know even that was not completed in the year 70 when it was destroyed. In the year 4, Herod dies. And I'm not going to get into when, and what we don't have here is when Jesus was born, because someone said he was born in 0, but how could he have been born in 0 if Herod persecutes him? So we're leaving that open for discussion and each person's interpretation. Herod's temple, Solomon's temple was magnificent. Zerubbabel's temple was adequate. Herod's temple was considered the most spectacular sanctuary in the Roman Empire. Put it into perspective, it was twice the size of the Acropolis in Greece. It was 52 meters, the Holy of Holies was 52 meters high, 18-story building. Josephus tells us this. Again, Josephus, the Jewish historian from the time of the Jewish revolt, was an historian, was from a priestly family, served in the temple, so his knowledge of the temple was spectacular, but also a brilliant historian, partially trained in Rome, who was the commander of the Jewish troops up north, surrendered, handed himself to the Romans, became an historian, and almost all archaeological finds. We read Josephus, it's exactly as he described it. The one thing Josephus got wrong all the time were numbers. Josephus was an historian. That's why maybe because he wasn't very good with numbers, he didn't become a mathematician, but his descriptions are extremely accurate, except maybe in Masada, again, different story. Now, the outwards face of the temple in its front wanted nothing that was likely to surprise either men's minds or eyes, for it was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising sun reflected back a fine fiery splendor, and made those who forced themselves to look upon it turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. But the temple appeared to strangers when they were coming to it, because again, you're coming from a distance, you're heading up to Jerusalem like a mountain covered with snow. For as to those parts of it that were not gilt, they were exceedingly white. Humongous, spectacular building. Stones, the largest stone that was found is found in the northern part of the western wall, weighs between 370 and 470 tons. Till today, it's a mystery how that was lifted. Because nowadays it would be almost impossible to lift a stone like that. How did they do that in those days? Easiest answer, of course, is aliens, because then nobody can ask any questions. But we really do not know. The pillars Josephus describes here in the royal portico over here took 3 people to surround them. There were 168 such pillars gilded on the top. And again, we can get an idea of Jesus' approach when coming to the temple, which is splendid, but what about the poor person? We'll talk about that later. So the magnificent element and the lifestyle of the priests who were there, who again were Sadducees, not so much Pharisees, but that's again a different lecture. Here is where he encounters the Sadducees and argues with them. Jesus, Jerusalem, and the temple. But before we get to Jesus, Jerusalem, and the temple, a story that happened before Jesus, very important because we can learn a lot. Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist. And we're told in the first chapter of Luke, there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, or Zechariah in Hebrew, of the course of Abijah, or Abijah really. Very important. There were 24 families who were working in the temple. There were priestly families. They would come to work 1 week at a time. That would be the time that they would serve in the temple. Before the destruction of the temple, there were 24 such families. Almost all of them were taken into the exile. Very few of them returned. That's why it doesn't say he's from the family of Abijah, but from the course, because after they returned, they had to re-divvy up the families, so there could be 24 families, and one was called Abijah because Abijah stayed back in Babylon. And his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth or Elisheva. Elisheva is a much better name because both of them have a meaning in their name. Zechariah, God has remembered. Zachar, Yah. Elisheva, my God has given an oath. Eli, my God. Sheva, like Be'er Sheva, the well where the oath was taken. And it came to pass that while he executed the priest office before God in the order of his course, his time came that every 24 weeks he is there. According to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. Now, we'll see a Jewish source in one moment, which will give an amazing meaning to what happened to Zechariah or Zechariah, because the Jewish law was lots would be drawn who would perform each of the acts in the temple. The burning of the incense was by far the most profitable that every priest wanted to do, because you would make the most money. It's a funny thing to say, but it was also the most honorable thing to do, and you could only do it once in your life. It had to be a new person. We'll see the Mishnaic source in 1 second. So what we're being told is that Zechariah won the lottery that day. And there was nothing he wanted more, I'm sure, was to perform the burning of the incense and to go back to Elizabeth and tell her, with the earnings that he made, that he won the lottery, because it was the first and the last time he could do that. It had to be a new priest. So he won the lottery, and there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing at the right side of the altar. And when Zacharias saw him, he was troubled, and fear fell upon him. And the angel answering said unto him, I am Gabriel, that stand in the presence of God. Remember the same Gabriel that was there many times before, the angel with David, the angel with Adam, the angel with the creation, and am sent to speak unto thee and to shew thee these glad tidings. I've got even better news for you. And behold, thou shalt be dumb, and not able to speak until the day that these things shall be performed, because thou believest not my words, which shall be fulfilled in their season. Now, Zechariah became dumb. He couldn't go back and tell his wife, which is a problem, but there was more to that, which unfortunately we miss out on if we don't know the traditions of the temple. And the people waited for Zacharias and marveled that he tarried so long in the temple. What were the people waiting for? He lit the altar, that he could do, and for that we need to turn to the Jewish sources. And the Mishnah, the Jewish oral law that was written in the 3rd century, either in Sefer or in Beit Sha'arim in the northern part of Israel, the third count. New priests, and it says, new priests come up and submit to the count for the incense. In other words, they come up and they can partake in the lottery, the lot. New old priests who will take up the limbs of the rampant altar. If you already won that lottery once, you do other times. The tamid was offered by 9. In the 9th morning hour, the calculation of the hours, that was the morning sacrifice, was offered by 9 in their calculations. Try to think what else happened in the 9th hour. We'll talk about that in a second. Now, for how was the rite of the priestly benediction performed in the temple? That's the blessing that the priests would give unto the children of Israel and the people that came. The priests went up to the platform after the conclusion of the morning sacrifice. In other words, the incense was lit, the morning sacrifice, and then the priestly blessing. So Zechariah, who was supposed to partake in the priestly blessing, that's why people were waiting for him, because he had to partake in the priestly blessing. But of course, if you can't talk, that's slightly difficult. Now, what is the story of the priestly blessing? And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron and his son, saying, this is the way you shall bless the children of Israel. Say unto them, the Lord bless the Lord, I don't like the translation, but I'm just using King James. The Lord, it says, really should say, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall put my name on the children of Israel. Because in the temple, when you would say the blessing, that would be one of the few times that God's name was actually mentioned besides the Day of Atonement, and I will bless them. Now, if you guys were thinking, what else happened in the 9th hour? Let's go to Luke. Now, Peter and John went up together to the temple, at the hour of prayer, being the ninth hour. In other words, they were going up to be blessed with the priestly blessing. And a certain man, lame of his mother's womb, was carried, similar to the blind man, whom they laid daily at the gate of the temple, which is called the Beautiful. We could give a whole lecture on where the Beautiful gate is. Most likely it's in the entrance to the women's section, maybe in the Nicanor gate in the entrance to the Azara where the priestly blessing was made, to ask alms of them that entered into the temple. So he was asking, they came up for the blessing, and they healed him. And of course, once again, the message is, you came for the priestly blessing, we'll give you the blessing, which might actually work. Here is the priestly blessing in Hebrew, again, and it can't be translated. And this letter, the letter Hey, represents, in the Jewish tradition, you don't write God's name, so represents Jehovah, God's name in Hebrew. The letters Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. It's, why is it like this? We don't know, but what is interesting is there are 3 words in the first part, 5 words in the second part, 7 words in the third verse. There are 15 letters, 20 letters, and 25 letters. Josephus wasn't a mathematician, maybe Moses was. So here we have an interesting element that's written. And here is one of the most, I can't go without mentioning this, one of the most spectacular archaeological finds, to my opinion. Because we all know the earliest biblical sources are the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here we have the priestly blessing, probably from the 6th century BCE, predating the Dead Sea Scrolls by at least 500 years. It was a lucky charm, an amulet of some type that was found in a tomb just to the west of Jerusalem. Here we can see it took almost 3 years to open it up and actually find this amazing priestly blessing. It was found in this spot. This is the actual archaeologist, Gabi Barkay, who found it. Here are the tombs. 2 of these were found. When they were sifting through everything and ready to throw it out, Gabi's granddaughter was with him and she said, "Grandpa, what is that? Why are you throwing it out?" He taught there were 2 little things that looked like cigarette butts. And here we have the priestly blessing, by far the earliest biblical source that, again, quite amazing, dating back 2,700 years. Now this is more, there's a movement in Israel I have issues with, we won't get into it, of people who are interested in rebuilding the temple immediately. And these are all people who are priests, in other words, mean people who are, the tradition in their family is they are descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Now, some of them you will know because they will have a last name like Cohen or Katz or Kogan. Those are all last names. In Jewry, they'll be called Azulai, and additional names that happen to be, but they are descendants. DNA tests have been done, and over 95% of people who say that they share a joint forefather, i.e. Aaron. Nobody else in the world has that same forefather, except, and we have to be totally accurate, there is a tribe in Africa, which most likely means somebody from a priestly family, who was a Kohen, a priest, moved down there, started a family, and now I think there are 15 million people that descended from him. Now, this is more or less, this is how the blessing would have taken in the temple. These people are dressed like priests. You see a small boy also, because in the Jewish tradition, from the age 13, you are a man. And it would sound something like this. So just one thing you Nimoy grew up in a traditional Jewish home. he would see the priests doing that, and that's where he got the idea of Dr. Spock's special sign, but that's a different story. Jesus is presented in the temple. Here we see just the background is a wonderful icon which exists in the Swedish Theological Seminary in Jerusalem, which the unique element, of course, is that Joseph is wearing a Jewish prayer shawl, which might very well have been the case, but that's a different story. But let's read about Jesus' presentation in the temple. And when 8 days were completed for the circumcision of the child, his name was called Jesus. The Jewish tradition is you do not name a child until his circumcision. When a boy is born, right after the circumcision, you give him the name. You can see the same story with John the Baptist, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And again, well, we'll see the biblical verses in a second. Now when the days of her purification, according to the law of Moses, were completed, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. We'll talk about that in a second. And offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So in reality, this is not one thing happening. There are 2 totally separate occurrences that are taking place at the same time. One had to take place in the temple, the other did not. Now, again, wonderful picture of what is happening. Now, in the book of Genesis, we read, "This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a token of covenant between me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised amongst you, every man-child in your generations, he that is born in the house or bought with money of any stranger, which is not thy seed." So the question is, who is circumcised? But here we have, in 8 days, every Jewish male shall be circumcised. Now, in the book of Exodus, we read, "Sanctify unto me all the firstborn, whoever openeth the womb amongst the children of Israel." In other words, openeth the womb, it means the firstborn son. And again, if there was a miscarriage before it, there's no obligation to do it. Only the first child or the first birth that comes from a mother, both man and beast, it is mine. And the firstborn of man among thy children shalt thou redeem. In other words, the original tradition was every firstborn belonged to and would have served in the temple. The story of the sin in the desert, the Levites rise up and they replace the firstborn. Should have worked in the temple. So what we have here, this is the redemption. You didn't have to come to the temple to do that, because you could have done it spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the children of Israel saying, if a woman has conceived and born a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. As in the days of her customary impurity, she will be unclean." Unclean is the wrong word. The right word is impure. We might give a different lecture talking about the problem with that translation, because they're 2 totally different things. "And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. She shall then continue in the blood of her purification 33 days. So we have 33 plus 7 is 40. "She shall not touch any hallowed thing," so she can't come to the temple because she can't touch anything, "nor come to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are fulfilled. When the days of her purification are fulfilled, whether for a son or a daughter, she shall bring the priest." What does she bring? "A lamb of the first year as a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering." Why a sin offering is another whole lecture, so we have many more lectures to make up. Now, But that's not what Mary brought to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement to clean. Now, so what went wrong here? What went wrong is the next verse. And if she is not Testament is giving a very clear message as to the circumstances in which Jesus grew up. He grew up with a family not of affluence because they brought with those who could not afford. So Jesus grew up in a very simple environment. Anybody reading that in those days would have immediately understood that. So the two different things in the temple, this was not Jesus' circumcision. There was no obligation to present him in the temple, but he did, in a way, freed from that debt. Here, this is where this would have taken place. Here we can see the spectacular holy of the holy and the holies of holies behind. This is the women's section. Here we have the priests on the steps. This is where there are many songs in the book of Psalms called the songs of the elevation, or really the song. Now, Jesus the lad teaches in the temple. A wonderful story. Anybody who saw this small movie, it's amazing. I learned a lot from this because I never knew that Jesus had a British accent, but there are many things that we can learn when we watch movies. So we have Jesus the lad coming to the temple. His parents went to Jerusalem every year at the Feast of Passover. In other words, they kept the commandment of making the pilgrimage. And when he was 12 years old, now I've heard many tour guides in Israel talk about this was Jesus's bar mitzvah. It was not. Why 12 years old? Because he's still considered a minor. But bar mitzvahs are at 13. In the time of Jesus, the only element of the bar mitzvah was that when you turn 13, you are then responsible for yourself. In other words, all of your sins you're accountable for. At age 12, you are not. So he's, in other words, the element of being 12 was that he was still a minor, or considered by some not smart enough, or not to be able to be responsible. Despite that, when they finished the days and they returned, the boy Jesus lingered behind in Jerusalem. I won't talk about that nowadays. If Mary and Joseph had left Jesus in the temple, for sure social services would have immediately been involved, and then all of history might have changed. But with that said, and Joseph and his mother did not know it, but supposing him to have been in the company, they went a day's journey and sought him amongst their relatives and acquaintances. So when they returned to Jerusalem seeking him, now so it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of teachers, both to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astonished at his understandings and answers. Now, the big question that I always ask myself is, where is Jesus's knowledge from? Throughout the New Testament, throughout the Gospels, Jesus is quoted with amazing Judaic knowledge, amazing biblical knowledge. He also has amazing knowledge of theater. Where does he have this knowledge from? Nazareth. Remember Bartholomew? That nothing good can come from Nazareth. Nazareth is the 200 people are living there, and yet we have this 12-year-old with phenomenal knowledge. Now, here we have of coming up, which they were fulfilling. We don't have to go into that. Now, here is, where was Jesus sitting with these people? He was sitting here in what's known as the chel, or the hail, most likely either on this side or on this side. This is the area of the temple itself. In this area, only Jews can enter. We'll talk about that soon. Here we can see the court of the women, the treasury. We'll talk about that with the widow mites in a few minutes. Here this is known as the women's court, even though some people say, well, men and women were here together. For sure, women could actually enter this area. Here we have the altar, the place of the slaughtering. And in here, only the priests were able to enter. We're not going to get into all the elements. There are four things that were here that are very interesting. The somebody who took an oath would come in here, make sacrifices, cut off their hair, burn in here. Famous Nazarene Baptist, of course, Samson. Here are the lepers. Jesus deals with lepers being impure. When he cures the leper, he says, go up to the temple, because you need to go through here to actually be cured. The beautiful gate was either here or here. Well, we won't get into it, but this is the area where people might sit around and actually study. Once again, over in this area, over on the other side. So where did Jesus get his knowledge from? Here we see one of the most spectacular mosaics found in Israel. This found Sepphoris is 4 kilometers away, or 2.6 miles away from Nazareth. There was a revolt, which an interesting thing in the memory lingered, where there was a revolt against the Romans, and over 1,500 Jews were crucified there. So the memory of Jews being crucified existed in the time of Jesus. And the city of main cities where the revolt took place was totally destroyed. And then it was rebuilt. So around the time of Jesus being a lad, the city of Sepphoris was being rebuilt and was the center of Jewish study. Now, his father Joseph, now this is my theory, even though I can say that almost beyond doubt I'm quite sure I'm right. If Joseph was a carpenter, as the text says, was a man who worked with his hands, he could not make a living in Nazareth. There weren't enough people. An hour's walk away, the whole city was being rebuilt. You needed carpenters, you needed masons, you needed people who could actually do the work, and this was the center of the study. There was also a Roman theater here. Words like hypocrite that Jesus uses comes from the theaters. So this most likely was the location where Jesus would have studied, and that's where he would have gotten his knowledge from, might have gone to work with his father. This is the floor of the spectacular synagogue. We know from historical sources there were 14 synagogues in Sepphoris. This is the only one that's been found. Again, the first fruits, the showbreads, the menorah, an amazing floor that was found there. And here you can see Nazareth to Sepphoris. So Jesus' knowledge that he shared in the temple and throughout his preaching, to my opinion, had to have come from Sepphoris, where the great minds of the Jewish world and those the story of the widow mites. Here we are found in the sifting project, which is a project that sifts through dirt that was removed from the Temple Mount. The poorest of the poor, the simplest of coins. You can even see that not that much effort was made. These are all, again, they were the. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts in the treasury. Of course, this is Jesus. And he saw also a certain. So he said, truly, and again, remember, truly, the original word he used was amen, amen. I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all. For all these out of the abundance have put in offerings for God, but she, out of her poverty, put in all the livelihood that she had. Now, in the treasury, in the horn, were in the sanctuary. On them was written, old shkalim, in other words, somebody who had the debt that he should have paid to the temple, or new shkalim, paying this year's taxes, or incense, gold for the cover of the Holy of Holies, 6 for donations in general. So this is, we know exactly where she was standing. She was in the treasury, surrounded by these 13 containers. Widows and orphans in the Bible are very clear. And if you remember, we're talking about Luke 21. In Luke 18, 19, 20, Jesus talks about people trying to take away the homes of widows. In other words, not keeping with the obligation. For shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. Now, just one chapter before, Jesus says, beware of the scribes who desire to go along in long robes, love greetings in the marketplace, and the best seats in the synagogue, and the best places at feast, who devour widows' houses. Now, why did I put in Matthew 19 here? Then Peter answered him and said, see, we have left all and followed you. Therefore, what shall we have? Because to my opinion, most likely what Jesus was trying to give, the message he was giving here, why was he so in awe by this widow? Interestingly enough, you notice trying to devour widows' houses. In other words, these are widows that have. Now, what caught Jesus' eye, to my highly subjective opinion, is here you have a widow, a woman who should be weaker, or is seen as weaker by society, having control over her destiny. She's making the decision what to do. She's not having the money taken from her. She is taking the message, and she is putting in what she thinks should go to God, which is the exact same demand Jesus demanded from all of his followers. You leave everything behind, you follow me. She is leaving much behind because she is doing what she feels God demands from her. Here we can get an idea of, here is the women's section. These are 4 lanterns that are there. Here's the altar. And here we can see the actual canisters of where the money would have been put. The cleansing of the temple. Then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began who were buying in the temple, and he overturned the table of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, it is not written, my house shall be called the house of prayer. Because again, word from it would become injured in the way. You needed to purchase it. The problem was that the people that were on the temple that were able to work there were corrupt, were cheaters, were people who were overcharging. Because everybody needed to purchase the half a shekel to give it for the temple. So what Jesus was attacking was not the presence, but the mafia element of who had control of it. In history, Jews have frequently been depicted, we can go to Shakespeare and Shylock, as money changers. Now, why were Jews historically seen as money changers or lenders? Because they were. Why were Jews money changers, and especially people who would lend money? Because in the Christian tradition throughout the ages, a Christian could not lend to another Christian and charge interest. And a Muslim could not lend to another Muslim and charge interest. And a Jew could not lend to another Jew and charge interest. That actually appears in the Bible. So in Christian countries, the only people, because nobody would lend money and not charge interest because you lose money on it. So who would lend the money? The Jews would lend to the Christians would lend to the Jews. Just the Jews were slightly outnumbered many, many times. So the people who were lending the money and changing the money were usually the Jews. So that's just a side comment. And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. For they were afraid of him because the whole crowd were spellbound by his teachings. And again, what were his teachings? Just quoting 2 sources, quoting Isaiah 56. Even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar, for mine house shall be a house of prayer for all people. So here we have, and again, interestingly enough, this is taking place in what's called the Gentiles' court, where non-Jews can also enter. The other source he's quoting is Jeremiah chapter 7. And it says, in this house, which is called by my name, became a den of robbers. Here we have Jesus actually quoting Jeremiah. Again, it's really a cave or hideaway place in your eyes. Behold, even I have seen it, saith the Lord. But go ye unto my people, which is in Shiloh, which is where the tabernacle was, and it was destroyed and wiped out, where I set my name at first, and see what I did to it. So what is Jesus trying to say? He's foreseeing the destruction of the temple for the misbehavior. In a way, even before he weeps over the fate of Jerusalem, he's giving this clear message, because the people that would have that knowledge would immediately understand when Jesus talks about a den of robbers, they would immediately go to remember Jeremiah and know what Jesus is pointing at. Now, there's a parallel story. Just the problem with it is that it takes place in a different time in Jesus' life. In the book of John, this is taking place, and again, there's a difference between the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and John, how many times Jesus came to Jerusalem. Not going to get into that. Is this the same story or these two different stories? Not going to get into that. But in John's story, there's a very different message. He told those who were selling the doves, take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. His disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will consume me. Here Jesus is quoting two very different sources. He is, for the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up, and the reproaches of them that reproached thee are fallen unto me. So here we have him quoting Psalms and hinting towards Zechariah. Ye every pot in Jerusalem and in Judah shall be holiness, and all that sacrifices shall come and take of them, and see it therein, and in that day there shall be no more the Canaanite in the house of the Lord. Canaanite here means thief. So here we have a very different, here we're talking about in John, we're talking about the immortality that took place. Now, I want to get an idea, give us an idea, because this will help us very soon. What would, when he went up to Jerusalem? Now, he came to Jerusalem many times. The typical path he would have taken from the pool of Siloam, which for purification, because every Jew had to purify themselves before they went to the temple. Interestingly enough, non-Jews were considered pure. And that way they did not have to purify this. He would walk up these steps, enter from the gates over here. That stop you and ask if I could help you. So this is the city of here. These are the actual steps that were found. So these are the actual steps built in the time of Jesus that he would have walked up, heading up to the sewage system for rain sewage that would take you all the way to Jerusalem. You would enter here, you have the three gates, the gates of Huldah. You enter from here. Now, this is the actual gate from Herod's temple. The exit gate, one of the two that existed. This is actually, here you can see the over-supporting area. This is of the archway. This is the remnants of the actual gate. And this is a picture, this is a drawing of what that underground passage, you would go under the royal portico and you would enter the court of the Gentiles, exiting from here. The royal portico, this is where this would have all taken place. We're going to go forward to Paul for 1 second and then come back to Jesus. Why? Well, we'll see in 1 second. Then Paul took the men, and the next day purifying himself, and with them he entered the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification until that an offering should be made. So here we have Paul, again, following Jewish law to the dot. And when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews, which were of Asia, we're talking about the 7-day celebration of Passover, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up the people and laid hands on him. Cry out, men of Israel, help. This is the man that teacheth all men everything were against the people and the law and the holy places, and further brought Greeks also into the temple. So what do we have here? We have Paul bringing non-Jews into the temple. Now, non-Jews could enter, well, okay, there should have been something here, I must have left it out. Non-Jews could enter up to a certain spot, a certain location, and then there's an actual sign I thought I had in the presentation. I must have erased it by mistake, that says non-Jews up to here. And that was as far as they were able to go. And then he was being punished, and with those signs, a complete one actually exists in the museum in Istanbul, a broken one exists in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So Paul was punished for bringing non-Jews or Gentiles up to the city. Now, Jesus says of himself, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every brand in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes. And of course, we're talking about branches, but not in this lecture. That it may bear fruit. You are already clean because the word which I have spoken to you, abide in me and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Now, why did Jesus choose the story of a vine? Well, if we understand what the temple looked like, and here we see the entrance into the Holy and the Holy of Holies. Look closely, you can see all along the spectacular, we're talking about around the size of, covered with golden vines. And where do they lead? They lead into the Holy and the Holy of Holies. Vines symbolize the entrance into the presence of God, as we talked about before. Anybody who had ever been to the temple had seen this. What will come to people's minds are the actual vines in the temple, the vines covering the two pillars that lead into the of holies. Of course, here you see the priests giving the priestly blessing. Now, doors also at the entrance and lintels over them of the same height for the temple itself. In other words, all the way up, we're talking 52 meters. They were adorned with embroidered veils with their flowers of purple and pillars interwoven. And over these, but under the crown work, were spread out golden vine with its branches. Remember, Jesus talks about the branches, hanging down from the great height, the largeness and the fine workmanship of which was a surprising sight to the spectators, to see what vast materials they were, and with a great skill and workmanship was done. Anybody who had come to the temple could not forget. We're coming to the end of Jesus' life, and we're coming almost to the end of the lecture, the tearing of the veil. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. Then behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and earth quaked and the rocks were split. Remember, we heard that description before. The veil tore, and again, usually the explanation that I think is accurate is, of course, the Holy of Holies is exposed. It's now open to all. That's the typical Christian reading, but there's more to that. The proto-evangelium of James, Jesus' brother, we're not getting into how Jesus had a brother, but we're talking about first, maybe second century book that was written. Many of the things written in James, people follow or quote or say without even knowing where it came from, because it didn't make it into the gospel, but many of the stories, as an example, if you go to Nazareth, you go to the Orthodox church there, you have the well, and the Orthodox tradition is that's where the took place. That's from James. Very interesting here. And he says, and there was a council of priests saying, let us make a veil for the temple of the Lord. Because they would have to make veils to be the second one in the background, and you needed small hands to make them. And it was a huge amount of work. Just remember how high up the ceilings were. And the priest said, call to me the unidentified virgins of the family, undefiled virgins of the family of David. And the officers went away and sought and found 7 virgins. And the priest remembered the child. Went away and brought her. And they brought them into the temple of the Lord. And the priest said, choose for me by lot who shall speak, and the white, and the fine linen, and the silk, and the blue, and the scarlet, and the true purple. And the true purple and the secret fell to the lot of Mary. Again, remember, purple in the Bible, and if you look at Christian art, is what Mary usually wears, because that's an element of. And she took them and went away to her house. At that time, Zacharias was dumb, and Samuel was in his place until the spoke. We're given a specific time, and Mary took the scarlet and span it. So saying is there's a direct connection from Mary before she gave birth to Jesus, and remember, she was pregnant at this time, to was torn. So the 2 things that she produced were taken away, but might have had a positive element besides that. Here we have a 4th century tradition that will take us back almost to the very beginning of our lecture. Adam was buried there at the site of Golgotha. Remember the Jewish tradition on the Temple Mount, later on removed there. There's probably the place, which means the place of the skull. Golgolet in Aramaic and in Hebrew means skull, got its name, since the contour of the site bears no resemblance to a skull. So Adam is buried underneath there. We can see in Christian art that when Jesus died, the tradition is the rocks cracked, Jesus' blood dripped down, touched Adam's skull, and Adam resurrected. Just as we read in the source of when Adam is being born, he says he is the first one that will rise again. Very frequently in Christian art, this is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Once again, Jesus on the cross, Mary in purple, and Adam underneath the cross. Last thing we're going to talk about today. Here we, of course, see Longines cutting into Jesus. Now, why is this story so important? Jesus is seen in the Christian tradition as the 2 things in a way. On one hand, the Paschal Lamb. Now, if Jesus was the Paschal Lamb is commanded, in one house shall it be eaten, thou shalt not carry forth out of the flesh abroad of the house, neither shall ye break a bone thereof. Now, we read when in John, Longines came forward, and they came, soldiers, and break the legs of the first, because the idea was when you were on the cross, you would die of asphyxiation. But it could take 3 days for you to die, because you could not, That's why you would have a small, if your feet were bent, you could stretch your feet up and help yourself breathe. If they would break your legs, you would die much faster, which was seen as a merciful thing. But Jesus, if he was the Lamb of God, if he was the Paschal sacrifice, his legs could not be broken. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But are they sure he wasn't dead? Well, what? And forthwith came there out blood and water. Now, the human body. Blood and water comes out of the human body at birth. So with Jesus' death, the message that John is giving us is that you have full rebirth taking place here. So that concludes our lecture for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I clarified myself to an extent. And if anybody has any questions, I will be happy to try to answer them. Even though, to quote my father, there's no such thing as a bad question. So all questions are their only bad answers. So, any questions? I'm trying to see.
Thank you, Joel, for that. I think what we'll do, we're having a few connection issues with your, I think there's a bandwidth issue.
Okay.
I was going to ask if anyone wanted any questions or had any questions for Joel, if they'd like to email me, it's julian@christian-travel.com. And what I'll do is then I'll forward that on to Joel and you can correspond directly with him. Is that all right with you, Joel?
Yes, that's no problem whatsoever. I'll try. Again, I can't promise answers, but I will do my best.
That would be probably the best thing to do. So thanks again, Joel, for sharing that with us today. It's been really, really interesting. And then judging by the chat, a lot of people have found it great. If it's whetted your appetite for traveling to the Holy Land, please visit our website, christian-travel.com. And as I said, if you've got any questions, please email them through to me. It's julian@christian-travel.com, and I will pass those on to Joel. So that concludes today's lecture.